Psychedelic Science 2017 is an incredibly important event, I think, in the history of the field of psychedelic medicine and psychedelic research. And I say that both because it is the largest psychedelic conference in history. There have been many over the last 30, 40 years since psychedelics were criminalized, and there's been all this effort since then to restore them back to a legitimate place in science and medicine. This being the largest conference with over 2,800 attendees and many more who came in just for free over the course of the weekend. Also, in addition to the attendees, we've had over 200 presenters from over 40 countries and 45 states in the US or more. It's the strongest showing for the field of psychedelic research that we've ever seen in one place.
So it felt like the timing of this conference was absolutely perfect for the mood and the energy, because we all feel this growing sense of opportunity and this big transition ahead, and we're going to need a lot more support at a time of great danger with the Trump administration and nationalism in Europe and a lot of the opposite of the psychedelic vision. The psychedelic mystical sense of connection is needed more than ever.
So many people said to me, I feel at home. I've never felt at home like this. And giving people opportunity to not just be reading or focused on their research or on their computer, but to be engaging and having side conversations with people during the lecture, so you're not just watching the YouTube at home, but then getting to learn from the person next to you and ask questions. And I think for the strength of this community, well, one of the many strengths, is the way that we all work together, because ultimately we really do have an understanding of a shared goal. And in order to do that most effectively, we really have to know each other personally.
You have academics, you have scientists, obviously, because it's a psychedelic science conference, but you also have psychedelic society leaders. You have people who create spaces for people to use psychedelics in a recreational framework. The second important thing is that the emphasis is on science. I think still, to bring the cultural narrative to a mainstream level, we have to use science as the foundation and bedrock of when we talk about psychedelic substances. I think it's a narrative that really fits well within what's going on in the mainstream, and I think with that backing of science, then we can start having person-to-person interactions to change hearts and minds.
Important to reconsider psychedelics as a valuable therapeutic option for the treatment of mental disorders. There seems to be so much promising scientific evidence that points out in the direction that psychedelics are really a very potent therapeutic tool if they are used carefully with the appropriate screening in professional contexts.
First gen, really early researchers, all the way through, undergrads who are thinking about this as a career and realizing this is a possibility as a career, which it really hasn't been for 40 years, 50 years. And now we have a generation that has a really unique opportunity that you can actually decide at 18 that you want to be a psychedelic researcher, and you can go to undergrad and get a chemistry or psychology or sociology or anthropology degree and go focus your graduate career on that. And this is a real option for people now that even just 10 years ago, if you were 18 years old and you were getting into college and you told people you wanted to be a psychedelic researcher, it wasn't impossible, but it wasn't this wide open field that it's really becoming, where all of these posters being presented, all of these conferences, all of these people are doing it. They're being psychedelic researchers. Even the undergrads, there's people presenting undergraduate research that 20 years ago you couldn't have done as a PhD candidate at Harvard. You just never would have gotten permission to study these things.
Well, I think we have 40 years where no research was really happening to speak of, which is loss of tremendous opportunity. Thousands of people could have benefited from psychedelic research. Psychiatry could have been, and psychology could have been somewhere else, and there now we could be much farther along. So it was really a wasted opportunity. And I see it as a correction, of the course. This was a totally irrational legislation, which actually the the drug czar of Jimmy Carter apologized for, that this was a mistake, governmental mistake. And he specifically said that people who continued the psychedelic research underground are actually should be seen as heroes rather than criminals. That is the error of the government.
And I think the importance of it is that we're at a time of incredible transition from basically 20 years or 25 years of moving towards starting research again with psychedelics after several decades of suppression. And these studies have moved from basic safety studies to early pilot studies. So the crucial transition that we're about to enter is the move from phase 2 to phase 3 studies. Phase 2 being pilot studies, phase 3 being the studies that will generate data on safety and efficacy to argue to the regulatory agencies that these drugs with psychotherapy should be legally available by prescription.
There was a large explosion of psychedelic research, interest in the use of psychedelics for therapy and science in the 1950s and 1960s. That was the first time, at least in the West, that psychedelics had been looked at seriously as scientific objects or medical tools. Now we're seeing more research happening into these tools than ever before, than even in the 1950s and 1960s. And that's after approximately a 40-year hiatus.
The most important thing is that it's not the first wave. That when psychedelics came to the attention in a big way of the Western mind, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and the experiences that they brought up from the unconscious, the culture wasn't ready for them. And so there was an uncomfortableness about the direct confrontation with death or the spiritual mystical experience. And now the culture has had 50 years to adjust to the backlash from the first wave of research.
Right now we want to understand these substances in clinical medical settings, and we're not encouraging people to go out in the streets and take things that might put them in danger, and we're kind of acting in a more measured way. So I'm hopeful that that will make it a bit more difficult to roll back.
What's happening now is much more mature. Before it was a kind of this revolution of the 60s. People were changing their exteriors, the way they looked, the way they dressed, and so on. What they did with their cars, painting cars psychedelic colors and so on. So every cop knows that there's grass to be found there. So it was not very skillful revolution. The Buddhists talk about upayas, or skillful means. This whole thing could have happened in people's privacy somewhere, and the culture would be totally transformed without any of the repercussions that happened. And this is much more what's happening now.
So maybe we have learned from that, and maybe now we're in a next phase with maybe more maturity, or where really things, and also a different political framework. No, we have advanced in many different ways in society. So I think, it's really like the second, it's 2.0 we are in now, and I think it's a very different environment, and maybe that now we're more ready to kind of accept this change, something that really we've been fearful for many years.
Truth matters. It matters if this is real or not, and we can't pretend that these drugs do things that they don't, because they do so many amazing things, right? These drugs really do have a lot of potential. They have a lot of power, and so we can't go around saying that these things do things that they don't, because it's going to take away from the validity of what they actually do.
Approach of science research was not so much developed as it's now. And so in this new resurgence of psychedelic science, what we can observe is up-to-date research designs that are applicated to psychedelic science, that gives us more data and more exact data, how efficient they are, how safe they are, what are the limits, the limitations of their use, etc. So there is new research tools also, like all we can do now in brain imagery.
The counterculture had not found its voice. When the counterculture found its voice, the authorities were not able to take the notion that people were realizing how sick the world was. The authorities felt unmasked. It's like WikiLeaks today. There was too much secret destructiveness going on in the system. When the notion formed, and not intellectually, but at a gut feeling that the world is sick, and the system is sick, and the system is destructive, I think the people in power correctly saw the danger, how that could lead to their downfall.
In the 50s and 60s, it was science and it was culture. And science was definitely up and coming, and it was part of the mainstream narrative. What was going on with Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey, that was completely outside. That was the other, that was the counterculture. And for that reason, there wasn't a lot of collaboration there. And we had the science that showed that psychedelics should be medicalized, that they should be used for things like alcoholism or depression.
The mental difference between the 50s and 60s and now is that during the 50s and particularly in the 60s was this escalation of the drug war, which was part of this reaction against the psychedelics and the psychedelic consciousness. And it's now becoming clear to more and more people that this whole system of prohibition is counterproductive. And it's not really serving the needs of protecting people from drug abuse. There's a lot of economic interests in terms of police and prisons and prison guards, and but there's a dissatisfaction with mass incarceration and the whole system of prohibition, because it was the system of prohibition that was largely responsible for the suppression of research, because prohibition relies on exaggerated stories of risks and suppression of efforts to study benefits. And so we've got that dissatisfaction with the whole architecture of prohibition, so people are more open to looking at potential beneficial uses of psychedelics. We have a disenchantment with what big pharma can provide. We have an increase in anxiety and depression in the world. It's more stressful than 50 years ago. There's still an enormous amount then. And we have this grounding of scientific techniques and sophistication in terms of how we do the research, and an educated regulatory bodies around the world. So I think there's every reason to believe that this sort of second wave of research with psychedelics will be able to be fully mainstreamed, and will, if we're careful and wise and respond to the fears of the culture, I think we'll be able to sort of bring it in for a safe landing and not have a backlash.